Unveiling truths, no holds barred. Keep those Bible verses sharp.
Welcome back to Bible Verses. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Mike. We're your guides through the ultimate heavyweight matchup. The ancient, unchanging text of the Bible versus the loud, shifting opinions of the world.
If you're new to the ring, here's the setup. In one corner, we have the primary source, a stack of ancient manuscripts thousands of years old.
In the other, the heavyweight champion of the world. Cultural hearsay, traditions, and the many misunderstandings of the world.
Our job is simple: radical detachment. We strip away the agenda, bypass the middleman, and look strictly at the text to see what it actually says.
No sermons, no traditions, just a no-hold-barred showdown between the Bible and the world.
While we wear the referee shirts, we aren't exactly neutral. We're rooting for the Bible because we've seen the evidence, and we're here to help you understand why it's the correct source.
Before we head to the Bible's corner for today's match, let's take a quick 30-second look back at the tape from our last deep dive. Is this what God purposed?
Last time, we dismantled the testing ground fallacy, the idea that Earth is just a disposable waiting room for heaven. We used the Bible to show that the Earth was specifically formed to be inhabited forever by humans.
We also traced the legal technical difficulty introduced in Eden and looked at the architect's long-term rescue plan, the promised seed, intended to restore the planet to a global paradise.
That brings us to today. We know the purpose, but now we have to identify the person. Today's matchup is titled, The Starter Pack, Who is God?
And this is a massive matchup. In the blue corner, the world is just incredibly crowded with ideas. You have the Big Bang theorists, naturalists like Sean Carroll, arguing that the universe started with a spontaneous singularity, basically, no mind required.
Right, and if we are going to look at the secular consensus, we really need to unpack what someone like Sean Carroll is actually arguing there. Because in his book, The Big Picture, he champions this concept of poetic naturalism. And for a listener who isn't, a theoretical physicist, what does that practically mean? Because on the surface, I got to say, it sounds almost romantic.
Oh, it does. It sounds like this worldview that acknowledges the beauty of the cosmos while completely stripping away any need for a creator. Yeah, and the appeal of poetic naturalism is entirely deliberate. It provides a framework for modern materialists to find meaning in a universe they believe is, at its core, fundamentally meaningless. Carroll argues that if you run the mathematical models of our universe going back roughly 13.8 billion years, you arrive at a point of infinite density, a singularity.
Right.
And the foundational argument of this worldview is that this singularity simply expanded on its own. It was governed purely by the laws of physics, laws that supposedly just always existed, and it required absolutely no external architect or, alpha and omega to initiate the sequence.
Oh.
So to that specific worldview, the very concept of a creator is just a superfluous hypothesis. It just clutters up the math.
I can actually see the psychological appeal of that, though. I mean, if the universe is just this massive, unguided math equation that eventually just resulted in us, it entirely removes any ultimate accountability. There is no architect to answer to. And this is key, Carroll isn't alone in that corner. You have evolutionary biologists standing right next to the physicists, heavily championing what we can call the biological machine argument.
Yeah, exactly. The new atheism figures.
Right, like Richard Dawkins and the God delusion.
That is a critical piece of the world's argument. Dawkins popularized that concept of the blind watchmaker. It's a direct rebuttal to the classical idea that a complex design requires a designer. Dawkins argues that the stunning complexity of biological life, we're talking from the human eye to the absolute digital precision of DNA, is solely the result of natural selection acting on random genetic mutations over millions of eons.
The existential implications of that are just staggering when you really sit down and map them out. If that blind watchmaker premise is true, then you, the listener, and everyone else you love on this planet are essentially just biological algorithms.
Gene-carrying machines.
Exactly. Under that specific secular framework, human morality, the concept of love, the instinct to protect your children, none of that is a reflection of a higher divine empathy. It is literally just a chemical trick your brain plays on you to ensure your DNA successfully replicates into the next generation.
It's bleak.
There is no higher purpose, no grand design, just survival and replication in a completely cold, indifferent universe.
And the mechanism they use to continually push that narrative is what Science communicators, guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson, often call the God of the Gaps fallacy.
Oh, right.
They present this historical narrative that goes something like this. Ancient humans looked up at the sky, saw a terrifying bolt of lightning, and because they didn't understand, atmospheric electrostatic discharges, they just slapped the label God on it. They called it Zeus or Thor. When crops failed due to a microscopic blight they couldn't see, they called it divine wrath.
And I actually understand the logic behind the God of the Gaps argument when it comes to ancient superstitions. I mean, it is undeniably true that humans have historically used the divine as a placeholder for scientific ignorance. But the flaw in that argument, the massive blind spot in the blue corner, is that they assume all concepts of a creator are just placeholders for ignorance.
Right, they generalize it completely.
Tyson and others argue that as the flashlight of scientific discovery illuminates the dark corners of the universe, the space left for God just gets smaller and smaller until he evaporates entirely. But they fail to recognize that discovering how a mechanism works, like gravity or cellular mitosis, doesn't disprove the existence of the engineer who designed the mechanism in the first place.
And that is the exact forensic distinction we have to maintain. Understanding the engineering specs of a combustion engine doesn't prove that Henry Ford didn't exist. But what makes the world's corner so incredibly chaotic today is that it isn't just populated by secular materialists and atheists. It is equally crowded with deeply entrenched religious traditions that directly contradict the data found in the ancient manuscripts.
Yeah, the religious hearsay is almost more difficult to untangle than the secular arguments.
It really is.
Let's look at Trinitarianism, which is the cornerstone theology for Catholicism, Lutheranism, Baptist traditions, Assemblies of God. They present this concept of a Trinity, three co-equal, co-eternal persons, all wrapped into one singular, incomprehensible entity. They effectively teach that Jesus is Almighty God himself walking around on earth, rather than a distinct, separate creation. For a listener trying to logically map out the identity of the creator, this introduces an immediate, massive contradiction.
It creates a permanent state of confusion. And it's often dismissed by these traditions as a divine mystery that humans just aren't meant to understand. But the religious confusion doesn't stop there. You pivot to entirely different paradigms, like the pantheistic perspective found in New Age traditions, philosophical Taoism, or even certain interpretations of modern spirituality.
I encounter that one constantly. It's this idea that God isn't an individual person at all. Instead, God is just the sum total of the universe. It's an impersonal force or an energy flowing through the trees, the ocean currents, the rocks, the cosmos itself.
The universe is God, basically.
Right. And it's a very comforting thought for some because it feels deeply connected to nature, but it entirely strips away any concept of an empathetic being with feelings, a memory, or a specific dwelling place. So, as a referee looking at the blue corner, the listener is faced with a dizzying, contradictory array of options. A spontaneous singularity, a blind watchmaker, an ever-shrinking placeholder for ignorance, a confusing three-in-one mystery, or an impersonal cosmic force in the trees.
It is a complete mess of hearsay. But when we transition our audit to the red corner, the ancient, unchanging text of the Bible, we don't find this philosophical clutter. We find a very sharp, highly specific forensic identity. The primary source provides clear, unambiguous data on a single, distinct creator. It doesn't present a vague energy field or a confusing committee. It presents an architect.
So, if we are setting up our identity audit today, we need to bypass centuries of theological tradition and modern scientific assumptions. We need to look directly at the ancient texts and ask the most fundamental, foundational question imaginable. Does this architect actually have a name?
The biblical record is incredibly clear on this data point. The text doesn't leave us guessing or searching for a hidden code. I want to look directly at the manuscript data, specifically Isaiah 42, verse 8. The text states, "I am Jehovah, that is my name. I give my glory to no one else."
And just a heads up, listeners, some people might say Yahweh, Lord, or just God here. We'll actually dive even deeper into that name in a future deep dive.
It's a critical forensic distinction to make right at the start of our audit. The mainstream cultural narrative often just uses generic terms for the creator. But we have to understand the semantic difference here. Words like God, Lord, or Allah, which is simply the Arabic word for God, are not personal names. They are just titles. They are descriptive categories of authority or power, really no different than calling a human being king, president, or chief executive.
I was looking through the manuscript data preparing for this matchup, and the discrepancy between the use of titles and the use of the personal name is just staggering. When you audit the ancient Hebrew texts, the personal name, the Tetragrammaton, represented by the Hebrew letters YHWH, appears roughly 7,000 times.
Yeah, 7,000.
7,000 times. It completely eclipses every other identifier in the text. It isn't some obscure trivia hidden in a footnote. It is the single most prominent identifying marker in the entire primary source.
Which raises an immediate glaring question for our audit. If the personal name is the most frequently used noun in the original manuscripts, why is there so much confusion in the modern world regarding this identity? Why do so many mainstream translations and traditions just use the generic title Lord in all capital letters?
Yeah.
To understand that, we have to forensically trace a historical contamination.
Yeah.
It actually stems from an ancient superstition.
Let's track that, because how does a name used 7,000 times essentially get erased from the public consciousness?
Well, centuries after the Hebrew scriptures were completed, a subset of religious leaders adopted a highly unbiblical belief. They decided that the divine name was simply too sacred, too holy, to ever be uttered aloud by human lips. They were terrified of violating the commandment against taking the name in vain, so they vastly overcompensated. Whenever they publicly read the scrolls aloud and their finger reached the tetragrammaton, they refused to say it. Instead, they began substituting it with generic titles like Adonai, which translates to Lord.
And as that superstition hardened into concrete tradition over centuries, later Bible translators, who are often far removed from the original context, started doing the exact same thing with the written text itself. They actively stripped the personal name out of their translations and replaced it with Lord, usually printed in all capital letters to subtly indicate to the reader where the divine name originally stood. But as referees, we have to blow the whistle on the severe legal and textual collision this creates. When you replace a distinct name with the generic title, you completely destroy the structural clarity of the text.
Yeah, let's look at a prime example of this textual collision. Consider Psalm 110, verse 1. In many mainstream translations that follow the world's tradition of substituting the name, the text reads, "The Lord said unto my Lord."
I mean, that reads like an absolute riddle. It's incredibly confusing for anyone trying to map out the entities involved. Who is talking to whom? Are there two separate lords? Is God talking to himself? Are they the same person? It perfectly fuels the confusion of the Trinitarian argument. But when you strip away the superstition and restore the primary source data, the verse reads, "Jehovah declared to my Lord." Instantly, the fog evaporates. It clearly and forensically distinguishes Jehovah, the Almighty God, from Jesus, his son, who is the second Lord, being addressed in that specific verse.
That structural clarity is essential for understanding the entirety of the text. Furthermore, the name itself isn't just an arbitrary phonetic label. It carries profound functional meaning in the original language. The name is understood to mean he causes to become. This is a definitive statement of capability and intent. It guarantees that the architect can adapt, act, and become whatever is required to fulfill his ultimate purpose. He isn't a static monument. He is highly dynamic.
That is such a vital concept for the listener to grasp. He becomes whatever is needed for you and for the timeline of the earth. If the situation requires justice, he becomes a judge. If it requires protection, he becomes a protector. If it requires sustenance, he becomes a provider. He introduced himself using a personal name precisely so humans could build a close personal relationship with him. Think about it in human terms. You cannot truly intimately know someone if you only ever call them by their job title.
Right, exactly.
If you are married to someone, you don't call them spouse. You use their name. Look at the protocol established in Psalm 91, verse 14. God promises to protect those who know his name. Knowing the specific identity of the architect isn't just trivia, it is the prerequisite baseline for the relationship.
But the secular consensus pushes back incredibly hard right here. This brings us to a major point of conflict in our audit: the origins debate and the scientific fallacies. The modern materialist corners us with what seems at first glance like an airtight logical paradox. If you claim that every complex thing requires a cause, then who caused God? Who designed the creator?
Oh man, it is the ultimate gotcha question deployed by the secular side of the ring. I've heard this in countless debates. The argument is, if you demand a creator to explain the complexity of the universe, aren't you just moving the goalposts? Doesn't a creator capable of designing a universe have to be even more complex than the universe itself? And if so, who engineered him?
It is a fundamentally fair question to ask, but it relies on a completely flawed premise. It attempts to apply the physical, linear laws of our universe, specifically the laws of cause and effect and the forward march of time, to the architect who necessarily exists outside of that created system. The biblical data addresses this paradox directly. He is identified as the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. If we audit Psalm 90, verse 2, the text states that he is God from everlasting to everlasting. Additionally, 1 Timothy 1, verse 17 describes him forensically as the King of eternity.
But how do we, as biological beings trapped in a lineal timeline, actually wrap our minds around the concept of from everlasting to everlasting? Let's use a thought experiment to map out this cognitive limitation. Let's look at a grasshopper.
Okay, a grasshopper.
Yeah, a standard grasshopper lives its entire adult life cycle in about 50 days. Its entire biological reality, its perception of weather patterns, its understanding of survival is entirely confined to that microscopic window of time. To a grasshopper, a rainy Tuesday isn't just a bad afternoon, it is a generational catastrophe. It defines a significant percentage of its entire existence.
Right.
Now imagine trying to sit down and explain a human's 80-year lifespan to that grasshopper. Try to explain the concept of a 30-year mortgage or the idea of investing in a retirement fund that won't mature for 4 decades. It is biologically and cognitively impossible for the grasshopper to fathom what 80 years feels like because its neural architecture simply doesn't possess the hardware to process that scale of time.
It just literally lacks the capacity.
Exactly. Similarly, you and I are bound by a physical universe governed by the relentless forward arrow of time, entropy, and linear progression. We have a distinct birth, a biological decay, and an end. When we try to comprehend an eternal architect, an entity who exists entirely outside of the dimension of time because he is the one who invented time in the first place, we experience a cognitive overload. Our brains short-circuit. But our inability to fully grasp the mechanics of eternity doesn't negate the existence of the eternal. It simply highlights the limitations of our own grasshopper perspective.
That is an incredibly precise analogy. Our limited lifespan imposes a completely restricted concept of reality upon us. The entity who put our vast universe in motion, the entity who established the very laws of physics, quantum mechanics, and time-space constraints must necessarily have always existed outside of those constraints. If he were bound by time, he wouldn't be the ultimate architect. He would just be another product of the system. Only a being completely independent of the system could have breathed life into it.
Which perfectly dismantles the argument of the naturalists we discussed earlier. The World's Corner argues that the universe is just an emergent property of physics. They claim that if you give absolute chaos enough time, billions and billions of years, it will inevitably accidentally organize itself into highly structured, breathtaking order. They point to quantum fluctuations and random biological mutations as the true, blind architects of reality.
And here's where we apply a forensic stress test to that logic, and it absolutely shatters. The assumption that unguided chaos naturally breeds complex functional order without any intelligent intervention defies every fundamental observation we have about how reality works. I'm calling a rest whistle on that. Let's look at the primary source data. Hebrews 3, verse 4 lays out a universally observable axiom. Of course, every house is constructed by someone, but the one who constructed all things is God.
It is the ultimate breakdown of cause and effect. Let's expand on that logic. Imagine you are hiking deep in an uninhabited, remote forest, hundreds of miles from civilization. You stumble upon a clearing, and lying right there in the dirt is a fully functioning, pristine, high-definition smartphone. You pick it up. You observe the flawlessly smooth glass screen. You know that inside the casing there are microscopic silicon chips with billions of transistors, perfectly aligned camera lenses, and a lithium-ion battery.
Yeah.
Would you ever, in a million years of rational thought, assume that this smartphone was the result of an unguided natural process? Would you conclude that lightning struck a specific pile of sand and raw minerals, and over millions of years of random storms, earthquakes, and wind erosion? Those elements naturally configured themselves by pure chance into a device capable of streaming video from space.
You'd be locked up for thinking that.
Absolutely not. The very presence of the object screams of intent. Design intrinsically requires a designer. The presence of highly complex functional engineering demands the pre-existence of a highly intelligent engineer.
Exactly. The logic is inescapable. And the universe is infinitely more complex than a piece of human technology. The Bible argues that the natural world is practically overflowing with empirical evidence of this designer's intellect. Psalm 19, verse 1 states, "The heavens are declaring the glory of God. The skies above proclaim the work of his hands." When you examine the precise cosmological constant that allows gravity to form galaxies without collapsing them, or the incredible quantum efficiency of photosynthesis in a simple leaf, or the staggering digital information storage capacity of a single strand of DNA, you aren't looking at lucky accidents born from a singularity. You are looking at highly sophisticated intentional engineering specs.
The evidence of the engineering is undeniable. But this brings us to a massive philosophical intersection in our deep dive. If this architect is so brilliant, so infinitely capable, and exists from everlasting to everlasting, knowing the end from the beginning, doesn't that inherently mean he already knows exactly what you, the listener, are going to do tomorrow? This is the determinism trap, and I want to push back hard here because this is where a lot of people throw their hands up and walk away from the concept of God entirely.
It is a critical trap to dismantle, and we
Yeah.
really need to dig into this because the secular world and even many religious traditions argue that if God is truly eternal and all-knowing, if he possesses absolute omniscience, then he must have pre-programmed the entire timeline of the universe from the very beginning. By their logic, if God knows the future is fixed. Therefore, every human mistake, every global tragedy, every individual choice you make was planned, scripted, and locked in before you were even born.
But think about what that actually means. If the script is already written and locked, then the concept of free will, which we spent an entire deep dive analyzing last time, is nothing but a cruel illusion. You aren't a human being making authentic moral choices. You are just a biological actor reading lines you didn't write on a stage you didn't build. It's pure fatalism. It turns the entire human experience into a meaningless puppet show. But here is where the biblical data radically diverges from the world's philosophy. The primary source introduces a magnificent operational protocol that we can call selective foresight or selective memory.
To accurately understand this protocol, we have to look closely at how the text describes Jehovah's interaction with time and his creation. The fundamental error the world makes is assuming that the ability to know the future automatically implies the obligation to know the future. But the Bible presents Jehovah as a being with absolute mastery over his own infinite abilities. Just because the architect can fast forward to the end of the movie doesn't mean he must, or that he chooses to do so in every instance.
I want to really build this out for the listener because grasping selective foresight completely changes how you view your own life. Think about it like a master chess player. Imagine an absolute grandmaster sitting down to play a game against a complete novice.
Okay, I like this.
The grandmaster doesn't necessarily need to calculate the exact specific sequence of the next 50 moves in advance. Why? Because the novice is unpredictable. And more importantly, the grandmaster doesn't need to pre-script the game to win. The grandmaster relies on their overwhelming, infinite capability to respond to any move the novice makes. They ensure ultimate victory no matter which chaotic path the novice chooses to take.
That's a great way to frame it.
Jehovah possesses the power of absolute foresight, yes, but he exercises selective foresight. He deliberately, intentionally chooses not to pre-calculate every single human choice. He restrains his own omniscience in order to protect the genuine free will he granted us.
If we dive into the deep theological and philosophical nuance of this protocol, there is a brilliant framework we can draw from regarding the intended nature of the universe. God is eternal, and his ultimate will is immutable, but he specifically ordained a large part of reality, specifically human interaction and moral development, to exist in a constant state of becoming rather than rigidly being.
Let's clearly define those terms for the listener. Becoming versus being. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, if the universe were strictly created in a state of rigid being, it would be entirely static. It would be a finished painting hanging in a gallery. Every brushstroke, every color, every shadow would be predetermined, dried, and utterly unchangeable.
Right.
But by ordaining the human experience to be in a state of becoming, Jehovah designed a dynamic, open-ended system. At every moment, a new phenomenon can emerge automatically based on prior factors and, crucially, human choices. He established the parameters, he set the physical and moral laws of gravity and consequence, but he allows the conscious entities within that system to interact freely and shape the timeline.
It's the difference between watching a movie on a rigid track versus playing an open-world video game. In the movie, the ending is burned onto the film. But in the open-world game, the developer built the physics engine, created the map, and set the ultimate overarching storyline. But you decide how your character navigates the terrain. You decide which paths to take, which alliances to make, and which mistakes to suffer from. The developer allows the game to breathe based on your inputs.
Exactly, you have real agency.
So what does this actually mean for you navigating your daily life? It means your choices are completely terrifyingly real. When you face a severe moral dilemma, God isn't sitting in the heavens passively watching a rerun of a decision you were pre-programmed to make a billion years ago. He is an active, real-time observer. He respects the staggering authority he delegated to humanity. He grants you the ultimate dignity of forging your own path.
And this ties directly back to the legal technicality we discussed in our last deep dive regarding Eden. The legal challenge raised in the garden, the question of whether humans could govern themselves independently of God, would not make any logical sense if humans were just pre-programmed robots executing lines of code. The trial would be a total sham.
Exactly. You can't put a robot on trial for a software glitch you programmed into it.
Precisely. The concept of a test only has validity if the subjects possess genuine agency. God allows the timeline to remain fluid based on our choices, knowing that while He hasn't scripted your individual micro-decisions, His macro purpose for the earth, the promised seed, and the ultimate restoration of the planet will still flawlessly succeed, regardless of the detours human free will creates along the way. It is a profound demonstration of restraint. Omnipotence isn't just the raw power to force everything to happen. It is the immense power to restrain oneself, allowing lesser beings to possess genuine freedom.
It entirely validates the human experience. Your life isn't a pre-recorded track, it's a live broadcast. But as we move forward in our identity audit, having established His name and His respect for our free will, we must address one of the most stubborn theological roadblocks erected in the world's corner. We need to initiate the Trinity audit.
Oh boy. Yes, this is where we analyze the three-in-one claim. Mainstream religious traditions dating back to creeds formulated centuries after the primary texts were actually written insist that God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit are the exact same person, coexisting as a mysterious Trinity.
It's the absolute cornerstone of the Blue Corner's religious hearsay. But we are acting as forensic referees today, and our job is to apply the identity audit strictly to the manuscript data. If two entities are truly the exact same person operating as a single almighty Godhead, they must inherently possess the exact same core attributes. Most specifically, they must have the exact same data access. You cannot hide information from yourself. Your left hand knows what your right hand is doing.
That is the ultimate forensic test. And when we apply this data access test to the biblical record, the Trinity concept immediately collapses under its own weight. Let's look directly at the words of Jesus Himself. In John 14:28, Jesus explicitly states, "The Father is greater than I am." From a purely logical standpoint, if they are co-equal parts of the exact same Godhead, how can one fraction be greater than the other fraction? It defies basic definitions of equality.
And the evidence gets even more definitive regarding that shared data access we just mentioned. Look at the protocol recorded in Mark 13:32. Jesus is having a detailed discussion with His disciples about the timing of future events, specifically the end of the current system. And He freely, openly admits there are critical pieces of operational data that He simply does not know. He states that the angels in heaven don't know the day or the hour, nor does the Son, but only the Father knows. If Jesus and Jehovah are the exact same person, how is it logically or physically possible for the Father to possess critical scheduled data that the Son is completely unaware of? Is God keeping secrets from Himself? It makes zero sense.
It creates a logical paradox that the Trinity doctrine simply cannot resolve. The text consistently, from Genesis to Revelation, portrays a clear, unbreakable hierarchy, not a co-equal committee. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3, provides structural clarity on this hierarchy. The head of the Christ is God. Just as a man is described as the head of a family structure in the biblical context, God is the head of Christ. Jesus is undeniably a distinct, subordinate entity created by Jehovah.
Let's also think about the practical reality of Jesus' life when He walked the earth. He prayed constantly. He spent entire nights in prayer. In Matthew 6, verse 9, He taught His followers how to pray, saying, "Our Father in the heavens, let your name be sanctified."
Yeah, the model prayer.
If Jesus were Almighty God Himself, who exactly was He praying to? Was He just talking to Himself in a bizarre theatrical performance to trick His disciples? When He was agonizing in the garden before His execution, begging for the cup to pass from Him, was He just negotiating with His own internal monologue? No. The text clearly, plainly shows a subordinate Son communicating with His distinct, separate Father residing in heaven. The identity audit confirms, without a shadow of a doubt, that Jehovah is a singular, distinct architect.
Which leads us perfectly into another massive expansion of our audit. We've forensically established who He is. We know His name. We know He is distinct from Jesus. But now we must address where He is. We need to initiate the location audit, and we really need to spend significant time unpacking this, because the world promotes a deeply flawed, almost universally accepted concept known as omnipresence.
I am so glad we are digging into this, because this is a massive misconception. If you walk down the street and ask the average person in the world's corner where God is, they will almost universally reply, "God is everywhere?"
Yep, that's the standard answer.
It sounds poetic. It is heavily influenced by those pantheistic traditions we mentioned earlier. The idea that God physically permeates the cellular structure of the trees, the oxygen in the air, the tectonic plates of the earth, and even the dark, empty void of deep space. But honestly, if God is physically everywhere, doesn't that inherently limit him? Doesn't that trap him inside the physical universe he created?
That is the precise logical flaw of omnipresence. If he is trapped within the physical dimensions of the universe, he is subject to it. But when we audit the primary source, the biblical data explicitly rejects the concept of physical omnipresence. God is described not as a diffuse gas, but as a spirit person with a highly specific localized dwelling place. We see this data point in 1 Kings 8:39, which states, "May you then hear from the heavens your dwelling place. You do not refer to a specific localized dwelling place if an entity is simultaneously occupying every single square inch of the infinite physical universe."
But this introduces a major conceptual hurdle for a lot of listeners. What exactly is a spirit? The cultural narrative has deeply conditioned us to think that the word spirit means nothingness. We think of a ghost, a cloud of mist, a fleeting emotional feeling, or some abstract, formless void that lacks any real substance. But the Bible insists that spirit is a real, highly structured, incredibly powerful form of existence. It is simply invisible to the human eye and operates entirely outside our physical dimensions of height, width, depth, and time.
To bridge this conceptual gap between invisible and real, we really need to utilize a modern technological analogy. Let's look at the radio wave or Wi-Fi analogy. I want you to look around the physical room you're sitting in right now. To your human eyes, the space between you and the wall looks completely empty. But in reality, the air in that room is completely saturated with invisible radio waves, cellular signals, microwave background radiation, and high-speed Wi-Fi networks.
Oh, that's true.
You cannot see these waves. You cannot reach out and touch a Wi-Fi signal. You cannot smell it or taste it. To your biological, physical senses, those waves are nothingness. But we know for an absolute empirical fact that those invisible waves are real. They possess structure, they are carrying massive amounts of encrypted data, high-definition 4K video streams, and power across vast distances instantly.
That is brilliant. So Jehovah is like the ultimate broadcaster. He exists in the spiritual realm, a higher dimension of reality that is completely independent of our physical material universe. He's not made of physical matter. He's not made of carbon, atoms, or quarks. And he certainly isn't a nebulous cloud of emotional energy. He is a distinct, highly organized person with a highly specific location in the spirit realm. But, and here's the crucial mechanism that answers the omnipresence riddle, his power, specifically what the text calls his Holy Spirit or his active force, can be transmitted anywhere instantly.
Which brings us to the operational question. If God is located in one specific dwelling place in the heavens, how can he possibly see everything? How does he know what is happening on Earth? How does he manage the intricate details of the universe without being physically bodily present in every single galaxy?
Let's use another analogy to map out this mechanism, because human engineering actually provides a perfect parallel. Let's look at the Mars rover.
Okay.
When the brilliant scientists and engineers at NASA want to explore the surface of Mars, they do not have to physically strap themselves into a Saturn V rocket, travel 140 million miles through the lethal radiation of deep space, land on a hostile planet, and scoop up the red dirt with their own biological hands.
No, they definitely don't.
Where are the scientists located? They're located in a highly specific dwelling place, a climate-controlled control room in Houston, Texas. Instead of going themselves, they send a highly sophisticated probe, a rover. That rover acts as their extended eyes, ears, and hands. It rolls across the Martian crater, drills into the rock, and extends their analytical reach across the solar system, transmitting high-resolution data back to the control room in Houston.
That perfectly illustrates the biblical mechanism of God's interaction with the universe. Jehovah's Holy Spirit, which the Bible identifies as his active force in motion, not a separate person, functions like that ultimate instantaneous data transmission. It can extend from his dwelling place to the furthest, darkest reaches of the cosmos, allowing him to perceive everything with zero latency.
Incredible.
The manuscript data confirms this capability. Hebrews 4, verse 13, clearly states that there is not a creation that is not manifest to his sight. Through his active force, he can apply his immense power, alter physical reality, comfort a human heart, or execute his will on earth without ever having to vacate his dwelling place in the heavens.
This forensic distinction between omnipresence and localized power is absolutely vital for you to grasp. It completely shifts your fundamental understanding of the Creator. It transitions him from an impersonal, everywhere-at-once force to a distinct, knowable person.
Exactly.
Think about the implications of that. A force doesn't have a specific home. A force doesn't have a personal name. A force doesn't have a memory, and it certainly doesn't have feelings. You cannot have a relationship with gravity or electromagnetism. But a person has a home. A person has a name. And because Jehovah is a distinct person with a specific location, he possesses the deep capacity for relationship, observation, and most importantly, empathy.
Which brings us to our final and arguably most profound round of analysis, round 7. Empathy, pathos, and the omega factor. We have established the mechanics. The architect is a distinct person residing in the heavens, possessing infinite power and utilizing selective foresight to observe this chaotic testing ground we call Earth. But the ultimate question remains, does he actually care?
The world looks around at the staggering, heartbreaking amount of human suffering. They see the natural disasters wiping out towns, the relentless march of disease, the cruelty humans inflict upon one another, and they draw a very bleak, cynical conclusion. They assume that if God exists, he must be an indifferent clockmaker who simply wound up the complex machinery of the universe, stepped back, and walked away, entirely apathetic to the grinding of the gears. Or worse, they view him as a cruel observer who has intentionally abandoned humanity to its misery.
But when we conduct a forensic audit of the text regarding his emotional capacity, it reveals a completely different, profoundly moving data set. The Bible demonstrates that God feels visceral, deep compassion. Consider the specific metrics of attention Jesus describes in Matthew 10, verses 29 through 31. Jesus points out that not a single sparrow, a creature of almost zero economic or social value in the ancient world, falls to the ground without the Father's active knowledge. And then he assures his listeners that they are worth more than many sparrows. He's paying microscopic, intimate attention to the granular details of our daily lives.
And the pathos, the deep shared emotional connection, is explicitly and beautifully stated in the ancient Hebrew texts. Zechariah 2, verse 8, uses what I think is one of the most stunningly intimate metaphors in the entire primary source. God is speaking about his people, and he says, "Whoever touches you touches the people of my eye."
That's powerful.
Stop and imagine the sheer biological sensitivity of the pupil of your eye. The cornea is packed with nerve endings. The slightest speck of dust, the tiniest scratch, causes an immediate, intense, involuntary reaction of pain and protection. God is using that extreme biological sensitivity to say that when humans are harmed, when injustice occurs, he feels it instantly and acutely. He is not a neutral, detached scientist watching rats in a maze. When humanity hurts, the architect hurts.
Isaiah 63, verse 9 provides further irrefutable data on this shared suffering, stating, "During all their distress, it was distressing to him." This completely, utterly shatters the secular myth of the unfeeling, distant deity. He is deeply emotionally invested in the outcome of the testing ground.
But there is one final, incredible protocol we need to discuss regarding God's empathy, and it relates directly to the infinite capacity of his mind. We call it the omega factor, which deals with God's flawless eternal memory. In the world's view, the strict secular materialist view we discussed earlier with the biological machine argument, when you die, that is the absolute end. Your biological machine powers down, the chemical electrical signals in your brain cease, and your unique data, your personality, your memories, your loves, is permanently, irreversibly deleted from the universe. You become nothing.
That is the ultimate despair of the materialist worldview. But the Bible introduces a profound, technologically analogous concept that we can call the backup protocol. In Luke 20:38, Jesus is discussing the future resurrection, and the text says that to God, they're all living.
Right.
Now, from a purely forensic standpoint, how can physically dead, decayed people be considered living to God?
Yeah.
It is because Jehovah maintains a flawless, high-fidelity backup of a person's entire identity in his infinite, unlimited memory.
If we view the architect as a being of infinite mental bandwidth, then biological death isn't a permanent deletion, it's just putting the file in cold storage. Every single minute nuance of who you are, your exact personality quirks, your lifetime of compiled memories, the precise neural wiring of your brain, your unique DNA structure, your sense of humor, it is all securely, perfectly stored in the mind of the architect.
A perfect one-to-one copy.
The fidelity of that backup is absolute. Death is not the end of your data. It is merely a temporary suspension of your biological hardware until the timeline reaches the restoration of the Earth we talked about in the last matchup. Because he is a real person with an infinite memory, he remembers you as a real person.
It is the ultimate manifestation of both his limitless power and his profound love. He doesn't just know about humanity in a generic statistical sense. He knows us individually, deeply, and perfectly.
Let's wrap with the scorecard. Mike, what are the main takeaways for today?
When we strip away the world's hearsay, bypass the philosophical clutter, and audit the primary text, the evidence is overwhelming. First, God is not a confusing divine mystery or an impersonal cosmic force flowing through the rocks. He is a distinct spirit person with a highly specific identity and a personal name, Jehovah. Second, he is absolutely distinct from Jesus. He is the supreme king of eternity who exists outside the bounds of time. Finally, he is not physically everywhere at once, but his active force, his power is. He uses that infinite reach to watch over us with deep empathy, actively maintaining a perfect backup of our very identity in his flawless memory.
So we leave you with this challenging thought. When you look at the breathtaking complexity of your life, the digital code of your DNA, and the vast engineering of the universe around you, do you just see a mathematical singularity that got incredibly lucky? Or do you see the undeniable handiwork of Jehovah, a brilliant architect who actually knows your name?
Have I been praying to impersonal force, or have I looked at the Bible's evidence that God has a name, a home, and a heart?
This week, read James 4, verse 8. Draw close to God, and he will draw close to you.
The referee can point out the fallacies, but eventually you have to step into the ring yourself. Subscribe and share if you found today's breakdown useful.
May your verses be sharp and your opponents unprepared.
Verses sharp.